Welcome to Nazarene Israel. My name is Norman Willis, and I'm the apostle for the restoration of the original first century faith. And in this part 19 of Revelation Simplified, we want to talk about why we should avoid what's called the early ingathering. Now, many of us are familiar with Yeshua's quotation at Matthew chapter 24 and verse 15, where he says that when we see the abomination of desolation, spoken of by Daniel the prophet, standing in the set-apart place, then those of us who are in Judea should flee to the mountains. And there's several different candidates for what this abomination of desolation is. Some say it's going to be a papal temple. Others have different ideas. Hopefully we can talk about this in a future video segment. But at least what we can understand from this verse is that there will come a time when it's appropriate to leave the land of Israel. So unless we have a business to be in the land of Israel, unless we're one of the two witnesses, or unless we're specifically called to go back to the land of Israel, it doesn't make a lot of sense to go back to the land of Israel before then. So people begin to wonder, why would we go back to the land of Israel before then? Well, there's many reasons. Some of us, those of us who are familiar with two-house theory, we're eager to go back to the land. But what I want to show you in this video set is why we should not do that. Now we want to take a look at the simplified version of the timeline. I'm going to minimize down here to the lower left-hand corner. I know some people don't like it when I do that, but I think it's important to have the screen real estate for the graphic. So this is the simplified version of the timeline. Now we believe, at seal 6. We just entered into the zone of seal 6. Now seal 5, that was 9/11, 2001, the tragedy of the Twin Towers, and basically the Arab Spring, the uprising in the Middle East, and all the dead crying out for mercy. At seal 6, and we're going to review those quotations in just a moment, we're going to see what many people believe to be an engineered nuclear war, the purpose of which is to give rise to the new world order globally, worldwide. After this, and then seal 6 takes a little bit of time to walk out, but after this we expect to see the sealing of the 144,000. Now we also expect to see, at seal 7, a half an hour of silence in the heavens. So now the global powers that be have their new world order, they're setting everything up, so there's going to be a relative calm. There'll be continuing terrorism, continuing actions here and there, as they continue to round up the fundamentalist believers. But it's going to be a half an hour of relative silence in the heavens. We do the math, that comes out to 20 years and 10 months. After this comes 7 years of the trumpets and the woes and the thunders. The last 3.5 of this is the time of Jacob's trouble. We believe we're going to see the abomination of desolation get set up midway through the trumpets, and that's when it will be important to flee the land. At the end of the trumpets comes trumpet 7, and that's when the harlot Babylon is judged. And when the harlot Babylon is judged, that's when the 7 cups, or the 7 bowls of wrath, are then poured out upon the harlot. So that is the great day of his wrath. Now continuing on, then we have Armageddon, which is basically an encore performance from the cups. It's also the wedding feast and the first war of Gog and Magog. But then and only then comes the ingathering, or what's called the second Exodus. And that's when Yeshua's people are supposed to come home and then live out life in the land during the millennium for 1,000 years. Now that we're going to see, there's going to be several opportunities to go back home to the land of Israel before that. Now let's take a look here. If we come to Revelation chapter 6, starting in verse 12, let's review what it says about seal 6. It says, "And I looked, and when he opened the 6th seal, and behold, there was a great earthquake." Now we've seen a prevalence of earthquakes. There's a lot of earthquakes happening around the world already. So at a physical level, we may see a very great earthquake, but we're also taking a look at the spiritual level. As we saw, there could be a societal shakeup or a societal kind of a quaking. This is what we might expect when we see the rise of a global new world order. So continuing in verse 12, it says, "And the sun became black as sackcloth of hair, and the moon became like blood." So some people feel that for a physical fulfillment of this, and there's also spiritual fulfillments where Yeshua's spirit becomes dark with the church and this sort of thing, and the Torah becomes like blood because the law that comes out of Jerusalem leads to death. But at a physical level, there's a pair of very interesting solar eclipses. We've covered this in other places, and you can search the internet for it. But these two solar eclipses form a physical X, or a cross, over the United States of America. Now, the first of these two solar eclipses took place on August the 21st, 2017, and the next is supposed to take place approximately 7 years after the first, on April the 8th, 2024. Now, exactly what relation this has to the other events at Seal 6, we don't know. So let's continue on. In verse 13 it says, "And the stars of heaven fell to the earth, as a fig tree drops its late figs when it's shaken by a mighty wind." Some people believe this refers to missiles. Other people at a spiritual level believe it refers perhaps to demons, which would be released at the same time if we have a nuclear war. Verse 14, it says, "Then the sky receded as a scroll when it's rolled up." Many people believe this is referring to what they call a nuclear mushroom cloud. He says, "And every mountain," referring to governments, "and every island," referring to national boundaries, "was moved out of its place." Now, this is something we would expect to happen at an engineered nuclear war, the purpose of which is to give rise to a new world order. In the graphic here, we can see what's called the Club of Rome, their plan for 10 supranations, or 10 supranational regions that they intend to govern the world by, whether it's through the UN or another governing agency that supersedes the UN. Notice the United States, Canada, and Mexico form supranation number 1. We're not sure how much of Central America gets lumped in with that. Supranation number 6 then is South America, and they continue to divide up the rest of the nations of the world. So, but verse 15, it says, "And the kings of the earth, the great men, the rich men, the commanders, the mighty men, every slave and every free man, hid themselves in the caves and in the rocks of the mountains." Now notice, at a spiritual level, what they're saying here is that the people are hiding themselves in the government. Continuing on, "And they said to the mountains," or they said to the governments and rocks, "Fall on us and hide us from the face of him who sits on the throne and from the wrath of the Lamb." So what they're saying is to the governments, we want you to protect us from Yahweh. We want you to protect us from Yeshua's wrath. So this fits with the concept of a new world order government that considers itself to be so big that it can protect the people from Yahweh's wrath, just like they attempted to do at the Tower of Babylon many, many years ago. Notice what they say in verse 17. It says, "For the great day of his wrath has come, and who is able to stand?" Now, what's so important about this, we need to note this, we need to understand this, because this is not the great day of his wrath. Now notice what they're doing, and I'm going to minimize down here to the lower left-hand corner again. So what we need to see here is they're saying this at Seal 6. So here we have the engineered nuclear war at Seal 6. But notice this comes at least 27 years prior to the cups, prior to the great day of his wrath. In other words, what they're saying is that the people don't know their Bibles. They don't understand the Revelation timeline. And because they don't understand the Revelation timeline, they don't know where they are in the tribulation sequence of things. Now notice, so we've got at Seal 6, we've got the nuclear war that gives rise to the New World Order. And again, at Seal 7, then we have a half hour of silence in heaven, which is 20 years and 10 months. Then we have an additional 7 years of the trumpets and the woes and the time of Jacob's trouble. You add those two together, and that's 27 years and 10 months, or almost 28 more years before we get to the cups, before we get to the great day of his wrath. And then we even still have Armageddon to go. But the people are thinking that this is the great day of his wrath. And so because they think that, they're thinking they're farther along in the tribulation sequence than they are. So they might think, now notice in the seventh line down there, second from the left, comes the ingathering. Well, if we think that we're already on the far side of the tribulation, then we may think that the ingathering comes next. And so there may be a point in time when people believe, after a nuclear war, that they believe it's time to go back home to the land. Now, Satan loves this kind of thing. Let me transition back. Now here in 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, starting in verse 3, it says, "Let no one deceive you by any means. For that day," and here he's referring to the day of Yeshua's return, which comes at Armageddon. But in any event, that's on the far side of the tribulation. So Shaul is saying, "Let no one deceive you by any means. For the day of Yeshua's return will not come unless the falling away comes first, and the man of sin, or the man of lawlessness, or the man without Torah is revealed, the son of perdition, the one who opposes and exalts himself above all that is called Elohim, or all that is worshipped, so that he sits as Elohim in the temple of Elohim, showing himself that he is Elohim." So we can talk about a papal temple and this sort of thing. We've already seen in previous slide sets. We've seen a lot of evidence for this. For example, we have in 2004, the Ashkenazi Grand Rabbi Yonah Metzger and the Sephardic Grand Rav Shlomo Amar are proposing what they call a United Nations of Religion to the Pope. I believe this is Pope John Paul. But continuing on, notice how we have 5 years after this, in 2009, I believe this is Pope Benedict, but Pope Benedict is meeting with Muslim leaders on the Temple Mount. Well, what are they discussing except the possible location of where these things are going to go? Now bring this forward to 2015, add 6 more years, and we have Arutz Sheva, or Israel National News, and the headline says, "Watch. Architectural plans for the third temple have begun." And our Jewish brethren are very smart, very intelligent, very wise people. They don't do things without having a need for them. They don't waste the time or the energy or the money on such things. So we know that a third temple is in the works. So the papacy is fine with that, because at Matthew chapter 24 and verse 24 it says, "For false messiahs and false prophets will rise and show great signs and wonders to deceive, if possible, even the elect." And this is why you need to know the Revelation timeline. You need to know where we are, because already we've seen a number of ministries say, I've seen one ministry say that we're already in the Great Tribulation. I've seen other ministries say that we need to come back to the land of Israel to prepare for the Great Tribulation. And all of these are in contradiction to Yeshua's quote that there comes a time when we need to leave the land of Israel because of the Great Tribulation. So this also plays into the parable of the wheat and the tares. Now there's many different interpretations of this parable, but you know what wheat is. We all know what wheat looks like. It's got a stalk with grain. We all know what a tare looks like. It looks similar to wheat, but there's nothing to eat. There's no good grain involved. It's basically a weed that grows, that it's a deception kind of a plant. It's a deception weed. It looks similar to wheat, but it isn't wheat. Now notice we're going to see that the tares get gathered up and burned first before the wheat. So in Matthew chapter 13, starting in verse 24, another parable Yeshua put forth to them, saying, "The kingdom of heaven is like a man," in this case is Yahweh, "who sowed good seed," referring to good Israelites, "in his field." And here we can say either the land of Israel, or we can take a global scope. We can say the entire world. He says, "But while men slept, his enemy came and sowed tares among the wheat and went his way." So here he's talking about false believers. He says, "But when the grain had sprouted and produced a crop, then the tares also appeared." The false believers showed up. So the servants of the owner came to him and said, "Sir, did you not sow good seed in your field? How then does it have tares?" And he said to them, "An enemy has done this." So the servants said to him, "Do you want us then to go and gather them up?" But he said, "No, lest when you gather up the tares, you also uproot the wheat with them." Now notice what he says, let both grow together until the harvest. We've already seen in Revelation chapter 14, and we'll take a look at it again, we saw grape and grain harvests. And he says, and at the time of the harvest, I will say to the reapers, first gather together the tares and bind them into bundles, perhaps in the land of Israel, to burn them. But gather the wheat into my barn, meaning later, the wheat or the believers on Yeshua, the real plants, will be gathered together into his barn, into the land of Israel. So now if we take a look at this, I'm going to minimize down to the corner again. We take a look at this, fourth line down, we saw the inset chapters, chapters 12, 13, and 14. In chapter 14, we come to the grain and the grape harvests. And notice the location of the grain and the grape harvests. They come in, it's an inset chapter, but it comes in between the trumpets and the cups, both of which are times of gathering together and burning. And then Armageddon is also a time of gathering and burning. And then only after Armageddon, then comes the ingathering and the second Exodus, only after the great day of his wrath. That's when the believers in Yeshua come home to partake of the millennium. Okay, so transitioning back. There's other reasons, other things that play into this. So, for example, we have the satanic or the Masonic prophecy of Albert Pike. Now, Albert Pike was a man, he was a 33rd degree Freemason, and he was also the leader of Freemasonry in North America. He had a satanic vision, and he wrote a letter to a man, another Freemason by the name of Giuseppe Mazzini. It's dated 1871, or approximately 40 years prior to the First World War. And he quotes things in his letter, and he says things, he uses terms that weren't even in, well, I don't know if they weren't in existence, but they weren't in the common use back in 1871. Now notice what he says. He says, the First World War, this is written 40 years prior to the First World War, he says the First World War must be brought about in order to permit the Illuminati, or the Luciferians, or the Satanists, effectively, a satanic red horse, to overthrow the power of the czars in Russia. Now, the czars were Christian kings. They were one of the last Christian kingships in existence. So we're talking the white horse. So red horse against white. So to overthrow the power of the czars in Russia and of making that country a fortress of atheistic communism, or the secular red horse. He says the divergences caused by the agentur, or the agents, of the Illuminati between the British and Germanic empires will be used to foment this war. So basically what he's saying is the war is going to break out between the British and the German empires, and that's exactly how it happened. He continues, he says, at the end of the war, communism, again the secular red horse, will be built and used in order to destroy the other governments and in order to weaken the religions. Now, in the other religions, we've got the white horse, which is the Ephraimite Christianity, the true Christianity, the Nazarene faith in disguise. We've got red horse Catholicism, or false kind of a tear kind of Christianity. We've got the black horse Judaism. We've also got green horse Islam. Continuing on. I'm going to minimize down here. Notice that this is what we've got when we talk about the Babylonian model. We've got the three religions, so-called religions. We've got black horse Judaism in the head. We've got white horse Ephraimite Christianity, or Ephraimite belief on Yeshua in the legs or in the feet. And then we've got the green horse forming the pockets of miry clay. Now notice it's all tied together by the secular red horse. It's all tied together by Greco-Roman democracy. Very important point to remember and understand. Almost the whole body of faith is blinded by that almost. But he continues, and he says, the Second World War must be fomented by taking advantage of the differences between the fascists, which is again secular red horse, and the political Zionists, which is our Orthodox brethren in the land of Israel. He says this war must be brought about so that Nazism, National Socialism, secular red horse, is destroyed, and that the political Zionism, or the black horse, be strong enough to institute a sovereign state of Israel in Palestine. And once again, that's exactly what happened in 1948. So Albert Pike's prophecy is still basically dead on track. Then he says, during the Second World War, international communism, secular red horse, must become strong enough in order to balance Christendom, which would then be restrained and held in check until the time when we would need it for the final social cataclysm. And notice once again, this is exactly what happened during the Cold War, is we had basically, you might call it the western leg of Babylon, the Christian world in which the white horse reigned, and then we had the communism during the Cold War, which is effectively the eastern leg of the Roman Empire. And communism was strengthened, and the two are balancing out until they need them for the end time cataclysm. Now, notice he says, so he's been on track so far, and then now he says, the Third World War must be fomented by taking advantage of the differences caused by the agenture, the agents of the Illuminati, again, we're talking satanic red horse, between the political Zionists, which is Black Horse State of Israel, and the leaders of the Islamic world. The war must be conducted in such a way that Islam and political Zionism, meaning the State of Israel, mutually destroy each other. Now, we don't have any doubts that this prophecy is going to carry forward, but the question is the timing of it. When the engineered nuclear war at SEAL 6 takes place, the world may end up calling that the Third World War. If it's a war that's big enough and strong enough and powerful enough to get the people of Earth to let go of their national governments and embrace a new world order, one would think that might qualify as the Third World War. However, the problem is, if the destruction of the Muslim world and the land of Israel takes place at SEAL 6, it's difficult to see how some of the other prophecies play out during the trumpets, during the cups, and during Armageddon. Now, it is possible the State of Israel could be destroyed and then reconstituted in a Masonic Lodge format. That's possible. But what makes more sense, now remember, Satan doesn't always get what he wants when he wants it. So Satan planned the destruction of the nation of Judah in the book of Esther, but Haman's plans were thwarted. However, where we do see a destruction of the land of Israel is during the cups, or the bowls of wrath. And we've already seen the inset chapters. In chapter 14, as we saw, you've got the grape and the grain harvests. Now that would be a perfect location for the Third World War and the destruction of the land of Israel, just prior to the ingathering, 7th line down. Okay, coming back. Now, I wasn't going to include this, but I figure as long as we're including a Masonic Lodge or a satanic prophecy, we might as well go ahead and use a non-canonical book of Scripture. Ordinarily, I only use the books of Scripture that are included in the canon, but there's a book called the Book of Jasher, or it's actually the Book of Yashar. It's not part of the canon, but it's referred to twice in the canon, and we'll take a look at those quotes in just a moment. The Book of Jasher. Jasher is not actually a person's name, but in Hebrew, it's Strong's Old Testament or Strong's Hebrew 3477. It's Yashar, and what it basically means is it means straight, or it means just, or it means upright. So Sefer HaYashar is the book of the upright, or the book of the just, or can also mean the straight history or the straight truth. So the book of Jasher, the book of Sefer HaYashar, is quoted in, or is referred to in Joshua chapter 10 and verse 13, where it says, "So the sun stood still and the moon stopped, till the people had revenge upon their enemies. Is this not written in the book of Jasher?" It's also referred to in 2 Samuel 1 and verse 18. It says, "And he told them to teach the children of Judah the song of the bow." King David did. He says, indeed, it's written in the book of Jasher. So when we come to the book of Jasher, we come to chapter 75, and it tells us something very interesting about the exodus from the land of Egypt. It tells us that there was a group who went, about 30,000 men who went home too soon, and death and destruction befell them. So Jasher 75, starting in verse 1, it says, "And at that time in the 180th year of the Israelites going down into Egypt. Now remember, they were supposed to be there for 430 years. So this is some 250 years early. It's only the 180th year. It says, and there went forth from Egypt valiant men, 30,000 on foot, from the children of Israel, who were all of the tribe of Joseph, of the children of Ephraim, the son of Joseph. It says, for they said the period was completed, which Yahweh had appointed to the children of Israel in the times of old, of which he had spoken to Abraham. And these men girded themselves, and they put each man his sword at his side, and every man his armor upon him. And they trusted in their strength, as Ephraimites are wont to do, and they went out together from the land of Egypt with a mighty hand. And we drop to verse 5. It says, and these men were very mighty and valiant men. One man could pursue 1,000, and 2 men could rout 10,000. So they trusted to their strength, and they went together as they were. It says, and they directed their course toward the land of Gath, where Goliath was from. And they went down and found the shepherds of Gath, feeding the cattle of the children of Gath. Now we're going to jump to verse 15. It says, and these men were engaged in battle with the children of Ephraim, and Yahweh delivered the children of Ephraim into the hands of the Philistines. And they smote all the children of Ephraim, all who had gone forth from the land of Egypt, meaning too soon. So everyone who left Egypt too soon got killed. It says none were remaining but 10 men who had run away from the engagement. And those of us of the two-house persuasion might wonder if that's a what's called a remez, or a hint toward the 10 tribes. So if the 10 tribes who run away from the engagement, they survived. Verse 17, for this evil was from Yahweh against the children of Ephraim, for they transgressed the word of Yahweh in going forth from Egypt before the period had arrived, which Yahweh in days of old had appointed to Israel. So the moral to the story is, wait until it's time to come home. Don't go home too soon. In other words, avoid the early ingathering. So the question is, what are we supposed to be doing then if we're not supposed to be going back home to the land of Israel? It's going to be very difficult to resist, because when they build a temple and there's other Christians going back home to the land of Israel, living in the land of Israel, learning Hebrew, these kinds of things, we're going to want to go. And maybe it's okay to go so long as you don't stay too long, so long as you don't stay through the abomination of desolation being set up. But here's what we're supposed to be doing, brothers and sisters. It's called the Great Commission. In Matthew chapter 28, starting in verse 18, Yeshua came and spoke to them, saying, all authority has been given to me in heaven and on earth. He says, go therefore and make disciples in all nations, immersing them in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the set-apart Spirit, and teaching them to observe or to guard all things that I have commanded you. And behold, I am with you always, even until the end of the age. And as we're going to cover in the Torah government study, when we get to that series, we're going to see there's a lot of things that Yeshua has commanded us to do that we should be actively, busily doing at this point in time until he calls us home. And these are of a much higher importance than going back home to the land of Israel early. So for more information, I hope you'll check the Torah government study. Please join us again for part 20 when we talk about why the United States of America is the land of Babylon and why it also will be destroyed during the tribulation time frame. Shalom.